All right, hello everyone, welcome back. So in part two here, what we're going to begin doing is looking at some of the comparison between the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. So if you recall, when we look at the nervous system, we said earlier that we can divide it into central peripheral. From peripheral, we can go motor sensory, and then motor somatic is largely going to be for our motor. So we have a somatic motor. We also have a somatic sensory. But we're going to compare and contrast somatic motor with autonomic motor. And really, autonomic motor is redundant because autonomic is only motor. Okay. So what we'll see is we'll look at somatic. So we said somatic is voluntary actions, right? So largely contracting skeletal muscle. Autonomic is going to be involuntary things. So smooth muscle, cardiac muscle tissue, and glands. So like salivary glands, glands that are secreting things related to the digestive processes, right? And then with our autonomic, we can further subdivide that into both parasympathetic and sympathetic, and we'll look at those here in just a little bit. All right. So first, we're going to pick up right here, and we're going to look at our somatic nervous system, looking at somatic sensory as well as somatic motor. All right. So when looking at somatic sensory, the term soma means body, right? Whenever we talk about the soma of a cell, we're talking about the cell body of it. Okay. So the soma means body. Somatic sensory has to do with information coming from the periphery, okay, from the body to the central nervous system, right? So this could be, and one of the previous lectures we've done before, we looked at general sensation, right? So like touch, pressure, vibration, pain, temperature, right? All these things are general senses. And then we also did lectures on special senses, right? Vision, audition or hearing, equilibrium, olfaction, gustation, right? We did all of these special senses. This is sensory information coming from the body back to the central nervous system, right? So this is ascending information. It's coming in from the periphery into the spinal cord, up the brainstem to the thalamus, and then to the cerebral cortex, right? Ascending information. Whenever we look at, and remember, this is going to that primary somatosensory cortex, which is in the post-central gyrus, right? When we look at somatic motor now, it's largely the opposite, right? So we're starting in the cortex, right? The primary motor cortex in the precentral gyrus, and we're descending now down the brain, down the brainstem, down the spinal cord, and then out to some peripheral effector. In this case, it's going to be skeletal muscle, right? So this is going to be largely voluntary movements. Now, there are some um, parts of the somatic motor system that we do not consciously control, right? And so this is what we refer to as the extrapyramidal tracks or extrapyramidal pathways or indirect pathways, like the tectospinal and the rubrospinal and reticulospinal tracks. These are tracks that we don't voluntarily control, right? But they're still part of the somatic motor system, right? So whenever you choose to move your hand or your legs, or your fingers or something like that, that is part of this. This is occurring via this somatic motor system, okay? Now, when we look at the autonomic system, the autonomic is going to be controlling those things and those effectors and processes that are below our consciousness, right? Below our conscious level of control. So they're involuntary. The autonomic system is sometimes called autonomic motor, which again is kind of redundant because autonomic is only motor. And then visceral motor. Anytime you see the term viscera, think organ. All right. So in this case, you can think of heart, lungs, stomach, kidney, intestines, bladder, something like that. Right. Now, the autonomic nervous system will kind of begin in the central nervous system. All right. So it'll go from the brainstem or spinal cord, and then extend out into the periphery, into the peripheral nervous system, where we'll get to some effector, right? We'll get to some tissue, and that's largely going to be cardiac muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and or it's going to be glands, right? So think of like salivary glands in your mouth, right? So this system, it sends out information largely due to some type of sensory input, right? So you have stretching of blood vessels, right? So in ABT, you'll discuss how we maintain blood pressure and what changes in blood pressure due to our blood vessels. And stretching of smooth muscle and stretching of the blood vessels stimulates the blood vessels to constrict, right? It stimulates a reflexive contraction of the smooth muscle, right? You can also look at CO2 levels or carbon dioxide levels or gas levels or hydrogen ion levels, something like that. Like when you get to talking about respiratory system and renal system, you monitor the composition of the blood and composition of different fluids in the body, and in response to a change in that composition of the fluid, you get some effect, right? And so the whole idea here, the very first lecture that we did, we discussed homeostasis. And now in this lecture, this last one for MP1, we're also discussing homeostasis as well, right? So we're trying to maintain some internal steady state, right? We're trying to stay within certain parameters for blood pressure, for heart rate, for respiratory rate, for blood pH, all these different things. We're trying to stay within a certain parameter, right? So for these somatic and autonomic nervous systems, you can generally compare and contrast them, right? So look at somatic, right? Look at autonomic. See, what are they innervating? Somatic is largely skeletal muscle, right? So voluntarily controlled, right? Voluntary and conscious. Autonomic is smooth and cardiac muscle, and then different organs. These organs generally have smooth muscle in them, right? So the way things move in the GI tract and how blood is kind of helped to be propelled along, how the bladder contracts, the bronchi and the lungs, these all have smooth muscle in them, all right? And then, of course, in the heart, we have cardiac muscle, right? And these are all involuntarily controlled, all right? As we'll see in a second, we'll talk about it, the somatic and autonomic nervous systems also differ in their lower motor neurons in terms of how many, how long they are, where they travel. There's also differences in neurotransmitters and the receptors that bind these neurotransmitters. So there are several differences, and we'll look at those as we move on, right? So you can look at this graph. You can also look at something like this that shows the comparison between the two. So here we know we're both starting in the spinal cord, right? Starting in the spinal cord, but we're going to different effectors, right? Here we're going to a peripheral effector like a skeletal muscle or sensory information coming back from the skin. And then an autonomic, remember we said autonomic is generally only motor, right? So you have a motor coming out, and then we'll talk about the synapse here in a second, and then this coming out to the effector being lung, being smooth muscle in the bronchioles, something like that, okay? So we can also look at the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems and compare and contrast them based on their lower motor neurons, okay? So when talking about their lower motor neurons, the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems are going to differ in a couple of ways, right? One, they're both going to start in the central nervous system, right? So no, central nervous system, so something like spinal cord or brainstem. You have the cell bodies within that. Somatic nervous system, you stretch out into the peripheral nervous system, right? Some peripheral spinal nerve, right? And you just have one lower motor neuron going all the way out to an effector, all the way out to skeletal muscle, right? So start in the central nervous system, right? The cell bodies of motor neurons are in that ventral horn of gray matter. You stretch out, you go into the periphery, and then you enter into skeletal muscle, right? One neuron, one single lower motor neuron, remember? And this would be receiving information from an upper motor neuron. You then have your autonomic nervous system. You start off the same, cell bodies in the central nervous system, and we'll talk about where in the central nervous system between sympathetic and parasympathetic because it's different. You stretch out into the peripheral nervous system, but note, now we have two neurons, right? Where in somatic, we only had one, right? So you have one, you synapse onto another, and then you have the second one that goes out and innervates the organ, right? Or the effector. So where these two synapse, they synapse at something called a ganglion, okay? Or if you're talking about multiple, you call it ganglia, right? So if you recall from a previous lecture, a ganglion or ganglia is a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system, right? So here's one cell body, and imagine there would be tens and hundreds of more cell bodies here. And so that mass, that collection, that aggregation of cell bodies is outside the central nervous system. It's in the peripheral nervous system, so you call it a ganglion, right? Because you have a ganglion, you have a cell after it, and you have a cell before it, you can name those cells the preganglionic cell, or preganglionic neuron in this case, and a postganglionic cell, or postganglionic neuron, right? Now, this ganglion, or this postganglionic neuron, sometimes it's just called the ganglionic neuron, right? Because it starts at the ganglion. So if you read books, you watch video, and it says the ganglionic neuron, it's talking about the postganglionic neuron, okay? So you relay the signal from this preganglionic to this postganglionic via neurotransmitters in this region that will then bind to their receptor. There's different types of neurotransmitters, there's different types of receptors that we'll discuss. And then this postganglionic or the ganglionic neuron is the neuron that actually travels out to the periphery and innervates the effector, right? So this is kind of the basic layout. Now, whether this is sympathetic or parasympathetic, that will change a couple of things. It'll change the neurotransmitters released, primarily by the postganglionic neuron. It'll also change the lengths of these neurons, right? The preganglionic versus the postganglionic, they're different lengths, whether you're talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic, right? But note here, in both, you have the postganglionic neuron. That's the one that actually stretches out and innervates the effector. So smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, GI system, something like that, right? So keep that in mind. So if we look here, more detail at the preganglionic neuron, right? Preganglionic neuron starts in the central nervous system, right? Brain or spinal cord, as we'll see. It stretches out to the ganglia, and it's going to release acetylcholine, right? Acetylcholine is always released by preganglionic neurons, whether you're in the sympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic. The preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, no matter what. No exceptions that I know of. They're all releasing acetylcholine. Okay, so here you can see preganglionic neuron, this kind of blue one. They are myelinated as well. So note this is myelinated, this blue, this one is not. So we stretch out. Here's our ganglia, right? So we have a ganglion. We're releasing our acetylcholine, these little red molecules. They will bind to this green neuron, which is our postganglionic neuron, right? So we have our postganglionic neuron. The green one starts at the ganglia. Remember, it's sometimes also just called ganglionic, right? So this is called the ganglionic neuron cell body. So here they're calling it ganglionic. We stretch out to the intestines in this case. So this is the effector organ. And here you could release a couple of different neurotransmitters, all right? Acetylcholine or norepinephrine, depending on whether you're in the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system, right? If this is still parasympathetic, it would be acetylcholine. If it was the sympathetic division, it would be norepinephrine, okay? These are smaller, they're thinner, they're also unmyelinated axons of neurons that travel out to the effector, all right? So here you see, when you look at, so like when you look at this image and then you look at this one, these are the same. The pre and postganglionic neurons are roughly the same length, okay? As we'll see in a second, they're actually not the same length, and they're going to vary depending on if you have this happening in the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic, okay? Now, the difference in this neurotransmitter we'll also get to later in this lecture, but these have different types of receptors. So not only are there different neurotransmitters, there are different receptors for each neurotransmitter, right? So acetylcholine has a couple of different receptors that it could bind to. Norepinephrine also has a couple of different receptors that it could bind to, all right? So depending on the neurotransmitter, and then depending on the receptor that it binds to, you could get a variety of different effects, right? So this is why stimulation of the heart with one nerve causes it to increase its heart rate. Stimulation of the heart with another nerve causes it to decrease its heart rate. Same thing for respiratory rate, um, pupillary constriction and dilation, digestive activity, all these different things, right? It depends on the neurotransmitter and the receptor that is binding it, right? So you can think of this as a flight type of situation, right? So imagine you're flying from Indianapolis to Chicago to Miami, right? You start in Indianapolis and you fly to Chicago. You're only on one plane at a time, okay? There is one, and imagine it's just you. You or your family or whoever, right? You fly from Indianapolis to Chicago, okay? One flight. From Chicago, the Chicago here, this is serving as the ganglion, all right? So you synapse here. This is your layover, if you will, right? And then you fly from your ganglia, from Chicago to Miami, right? This would be the postganglionic neuron. This would be the preganglionic neuron, okay? And then Chicago itself would be the layover. It would be the ganglia, right? Now, note that from Chicago, and they don't show it on here, but Chicago, you can't just fly to Miami, but you could also fly to New Hampshire or Maine. You could fly up to Montana. You could fly to California. You could fly to New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana. You could fly anywhere in the country from Chicago, right? So this is representing this idea of divergence, okay? So there's also convergence. You can have multiple different neurons expand out and stretch out from a single ganglia, right? So in the chart that we looked at previously, it showed, one preganglionic neuron and one postganglionic neuron. That's kind of an oversimplification, right? You can have multiple postganglionic neurons and multiple preganglionic neurons converging or diverging from a ganglia, right? So you can see that here. You have multiple neurons, postganglionic, radiating out to all of our peripheral effectors, okay? So we are going to stop here with this part. We're going to pick up with part 3 by discussing parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, then getting into sympathetic division, and then into a bit more detail for each of those.